we have the wonderful Martin Macmillan of Pollen, who's going to be our first speaker. He'll be joining us shortly. He's just popping in now. And he's going to give us an insight, I believe, into how to extract, that sounds a bit hard, extract maximum value from our users. How to make the most money, really, which I don't think anyone's not going to be interested in. I think it's pretty much universal. There he goes. Martin's already in. Blimey, straight in. He's opened up his screen share. How are you doing, Martin?
I am good, Chris. How are you doing? How's the show going?
I'm very good. I'm very good. You're in that London, are you? Or where
I am back. Yeah, we moved back to London from the US last year, so I'm in southwest London.
But fair enough. Well, it's a bit overcast in London today, but yeah, it means you don't have to get up quite as early as if you're in the US, I guess. So that's good. Exactly. Cool. Right. Well, you've queued up your video, which was fantastic. Gave a great introduction anyway, and I'm sure you're now going to talk a bit more about talk about how much your users are worth and how you can get the best value out of them. Right. That's the gist.
That's the ticket. Yeah. Cool. Great. So thank you very much for having us. We're delighted to be a sponsor of this of this track. We're going to go a little bit. The title of this one is basically something that we get asked a lot about, and we've developed some methodologies. And the idea here is we're going to try and help you kind of figure out how much value is trapped in your existing users. So hopefully you can see the screen. Just give you a tiny bit of background into what we do. As the video said before, we provide flexible credit facilities to game developers to help them grow. We do that in a non-dilutive way. So this is debt-based instrument rather than equity, and they're basically completely elastic revolving credit lines based on your accounts receivable, but also how much value is trapped. So we can typically lend somewhere between 2 and 4 times monthly revenues, depending on how much value we can detect. Our sort of higher purpose here is we're putting a lot of effort into trying to raise the financial literacy of game developers, really, to help them make more informed choices. So one of the things we do is we have a CFO resources page on our website, and there's a lot of tools and calculators and content and stuff on there with the idea of helping you guys make more informed financial decisions. But today we're going to focus on the how much value is trapped in existing users. Just going to give a very quick insight. Most of this is, I'm sure, is sort of pretty straightforward for most people, but just to set the scene, there's a few things we care about from a financial point of view to set up about how we're actually going to detect the value and price the value in existing users. So just a quick refresher on the LTV journey. So the key things we really care about are how much do you have to pay to acquire a user regarding whatever metric you care about. Really important when you break even. The day you break even, I mean, obviously if you break even, is super important, and really sets the tone for some of the financial metrics of how the business can grow. And then ultimately, where you cut off LTV, how long do you think about it as a journey? Basically, is the end point in the journey. Do you do that? Is it 90 days, 180 days, 360 days? Totally depends on the game retention pattern. And again, on our CFO resources page, we have some tools to help with that. Our business at Pollen is all about curves, right? So we care about gradients of lines and building curves and fitting curves and so on. And this is basically just an LTV curve where the key things we care about are when do I break even, and then how long does it take to achieve what kind of return on that. So all about curves, and again, it's something we love talking about. So going to introduce this new kind of concept, or at least newish to us, if you like, around residual cohort value. So this is basically how much value is trapped in your existing users, and how can you basically price it, figure out a monetary value, and then what can you do with that. So that's really the key things we're going to explore today. So residual cohort value. So think about it like this. If you stopped all user acquisition today, how long would it be before the last player left the game? Now, obviously, that's very kind of hard to price, if you like, but the concept is the same. So you stop doing user acquisition, and then basically all of these cohorts play out over time. And how can you effectively, what you're trying to do here is to model the area under the curve. So a couple of do's and don'ts. First of all, this kind of methodology would include the organics that are earned that are directly correlated to paid UA. So your K factor, you acquire a user, you get half a free user based on that if you can attribute that back. So those organic users would be included in this methodology. What's not included in the methodology is if you just have fantastic user acquisition through a completely organic channel that you acquire 1,000 users a day just through people searching for what you're doing, then this wouldn't be, and you need to kind of price that separately. But again, that should be if it's static, it should be relatively easy to price. It's a big question here. Why do you care? So first of all, from the point of view of M&A, if you ever want to sell one of your titles, or sell the studio if you've only got one game, whatever it might be, this is really, really important to set the tone, and to give some sort of what's my studio worth or what's my game worth. It gives some kind of baseline valuation mechanic. So this is pricing this even somewhat accurately is going to give you a really good measure of value, probably more relevant than an EBITDA valuation metric, because that can be very dependent on ongoing user acquisition, so on as well. And also from just one point, an LTV duration, which is the time it takes to get your money out. Obviously, the more data you have, the longer you can project. So we'd always advise people to be super careful about projecting LTVs off where you don't have enough cohort level data to really project it. But obviously, the longer the data period you're able to acquire, then the more accurate you can be, and the more sure you can be doing longer dated LTV projections. Excuse me. So the other thing that's important about your residual cohorts is you can also think of them as an asset, right? So this is just revenue that, this is a user that has been purchased, right? So there's not the question mark over the UA side, but the money hasn't come out the other end, right? So you have to, provided you keep your live ops and your servers running and all the rest of it, you can predict with a fairly good degree of certainty that this revenue will be earned, because you know what the cohort behavior pattern really looks like. And again, this is something we've started recently doing at Pollen, is we can lend against this residual value as an asset. So again, there's two things in our model. We look at the platform receivables and then also the residual value, and we push these together and use these two different assets to baseline the amount of credit. So I'm going to move on now. Talk about cohorts a little bit, because this is super important. And again, this is just a very simple kind of model. If you look at a single cohort, say the green one on the bottom, that's basically the kind of revenues earned over time. And then what you're doing is we've got 10 cohorts here. We're stacking them on top of each other, new cohort every day. And so by day 10, the 10th of January in this example, you can see what our daily revenues are, but you also know that these are going to decay over time. So basically, this is just a bunch of retention curves really layered on top of each other, but it gives hopefully an interesting kind of starting point around how to stack these on top of each other. This is the overall financial picture. So next then, if we were to look at just different ways of plotting cohort performance. So this is what we're looking at doing is a cumulative LTV journey. So for each one of these cohorts, it starts off its journey and will go towards different paths. They won't all converge at the same LTV. They'll all be a little bit different. Some will be some will monetize quicker, some won't monetize as quickly, etc. But each one of these cohorts has a journey. Now, the really important thing for you guys to monitor is a cohort level LTV, and typically that's done through working with a mobile measurement partner, an MMP, who can really help you understand the cohorts you're acquiring on particular channels, and then to model the behavior of each of those. But this in its own is just a bit of a mess. So what I'm going to do now is to rebase all of these different curves to time zero, to day one, whatever you want to call it, right? So this now gives us an idea of what these curves look like if they were to be sort of stacked on top of each other at the same starting point. This again is cumulative LTV on a cohort basis. Now, if we're trying to then estimate, and this is obviously an oversimplification of it, but just for illustration purposes, how you might start to think about this. You can run a simple regression analysis to fit a curve based on all the different curves you have, basically to look at. And sorry, I just realised we didn't name the axis here. But this is basically revenue over time. So it's an aggregation of all of these different cohorts over time, which is going to give you a decent way to kind of project into the future. So I'm gonna switch gears a little bit now and to talk about the financial aspect of it. And this is something that is very often kind of overlooked, right? So you've got to think of each cohort is a journey to an ultimate LTV, and so I'm gonna and these three cohorts, they can be if you know what the projection is likely to be, then you can classify these in different ways depending on the age of the cohort. And this is where accounts receivable merges into the residual cohort value. Another way to think about residual cohorts is this is an expected receivable, right? So this is money that will be generated on the platforms and will ultimately be paid out to you. So that's its journey. So look at the financial journey of a young cohort here. So we've got, let's say, 180-day lifetime value cutoff. And let's say for purposes of this discussion, we are 15 days into that cohort. So if you look at the first bit of the golden triangle there, that's marked out as AR. So that's money that has, say, been earned on one of the ad networks, or it's been earned as an IAP, and it's, say, sitting in the bank of Apple waiting to be paid out. But you've banked that revenue effectively because because you can see it and it's verified. But the rest of it is just an expected value. So you hope that is going to achieve that ultimate LTV over the next 165 days, which is where you've done your calculation cutoffs. Next one is you fast forward and you look at something that's midlife, right? So here we've done 60 days. So basically you can see that the 60-day part of the triangle, again, that's all in receivables, right? That could be all in the bank of Apple or Unity or ironSource or any of these guys here. It's a much bigger proportion. It's a much bigger monetary amount. And then you have the next 120 days instead of the next 165 days to figure out, okay, well, here's where I've got to. Here's where I expect the ball to land when I throw it out the window, if you like. So I'm still, but it's more certain is the point, right? So the more the further into a cohort behavior, the more certainty you have, because you've either banked the money, as we'll talk about in a second, or you've actually you can see and verify the sales receipts sitting within the platform, and there's less there's less expected residual at that point. And then you look at a mature cohort. So you look at something that's, in this case, 120 days in. So you look at the first 60 days, the red triangle, you've already seen the cash for it. It's been sitting in the platform's bank account for 60 days. Then they've paid it out to you. So that money's gone. You've taken it and banked it. You have a smaller proportion of receivables, and then at this point you have a pretty small proportion of expected receivable, right? So this is the difference between 120 days, 180 days. That money is, you're way further through, so there's a greater degree of certainty. So basically, the way to think about this is that every cohort you have is at a different stage in its maturity and its different life cycle. So I'm going to come back to something we talk about a lot, which is the concept of the UA machine. This is really simple things like, do I have a machine? How can I fund my machine? And how do I know when it's running at full capacity? So as a company, we just think about UA as an investment equation. So it's literally how much in, when do I break even, how much out, and then how do you bring that back into sort of financial metrics of, let's say normally we look at like a monthly return on on investment of the ad spend, and then once you've brought everything down to a comparison metric, there is a lot of stuff you can do with it. And it comes down to three things. Does UA work in the first place? How am I going to fund it? And how do I know when I'm spending as much as I can on a daily or weekly basis, and anything more is just going to be unprofitable. So that's what we think of as the machine running at full capacity. So once you've identified, which is probably the hardest part, if you have a UA machine at all, the next question is how to fund it. And this goes between, and this is really a question for finance leads and UA leads, right? One of the best recipes for success is when finance and UA work together in terms of trying to figure out how to fund this machine. So, and it's a very simple, it's a dispassionate stack, right? So you've figured out that every dollar investor is going to invest, going to get you $1.50 or $2, whatever in LTV. So how are you going to fund that for for as long as the well is open for drinking? So you start off, if you have a credit facility from Facebook or Google or whoever, it always makes sense to use that first. It's effectively free money, or the other way to think about it, it's an LTV risk transfer from you onto the ad network. So if they're prepared to take it, you should absolutely max that out first. Then you look at your next best alternative. So then you look at, do I have a bunch of free cash flow sitting in the bank? Now, there's a distinction here between free cash flow from let's say another game that's cash flow positive, and there's the distinction between half of your venture capital round sitting in the bank, which obviously has a much higher cost because it's the equity capital. So here really I'm talking about free cash flow, cash that might be sitting in the bank earning point something of a percent of interest. You can also play the credit card game as well. So if you want to match interest-free periods on credit cards and take the air miles, totally valid strategy. We see empirically a lot less people playing this game because the risk of maxing out cards, maxing out, etc. is just too great. So people are sort of moving away from this. Next down the stack is credit facilities. So the type of facilities that we provide here at Pollen. These are typically secured against either just accounts receivable, or in our case, accounts receivable and residual cohorts. Below that, you've got revenue-based loans. And that's typically where someone will lend you an amount of money with the expectation you put it into user acquisition, and then they'll take a revenue share off the back of it. So it has a higher risk profile because it's not matched to your own, specific stats. It's about something that's going to happen in the future as opposed to has happened already, which is the distinction between users you've already acquired and users you plan to acquire. And so typically that's at a higher cost. And then right at the bottom, you have VC funding. So fortunately, we see a load less people now just raising venture capital and then spanking a lot of it on user acquisition. People are starting to get the concept of capital efficiency and using debt products to finance user acquisition rather than equity. And then lastly, the way that we think about this as well, if you're comparing your numbers out, is break everything down into a simple return, right? So what your ultimate LTV is, work that back, subtract your acquisition cost from your LTV, and then work that back into a monthly return. So what is your monthly return on? It's not on the ad spend; it's the ROI on the ad spend. So let's say I turn $1 into $1.60 after 90 days. That's giving me a 60% return after 90 days or 20% return after 30 days. So my monthly return is 20%. Now let's say I have to go and borrow the dollar to put into this equation, and that costs me say 1.5% for the time frame. Then it's still giving me, after I subtract my cost of capital, my return, my profit is 18.5% from 20%. So I'm going to keep burning through that for as long as I can, whilst I'm generating profits that meet my minimum hurdle rate or whatever. So the trick is to know when this machine is running at full capacity, and that's really something that's highly personal to every different game and company out there, because the economics will chop around so much. I'm going to do one more slide here, and it's the concept of demand economics. So this is basically, your LTV and your acquisition cost is just the demand and supply curve. You don't know what those curves look like. Are they exponential? Are they straight line? It's going to be totally different, so many different factors. But ultimately, if you go back to basic economic theory, what you're looking at is the intersection where your acquisition costs equal your lifetime values. that's the point that it doesn't make sense to buy anymore. You know that you're going to be unprofitable. You probably, in a freemium world, you probably want to build in a minimum margin. If you get your numbers wrong, you don't want to be underwater. But this is really just about sort of demand economics. So kind of quick recap in terms of thinking about what value you've created in your business and how to extract as much value as possible. Think about not necessarily just the users you could acquire, but think about the users you have acquired, what they're worth, and then how you can make them work for you, whether that be setting a baseline valuation for an acquisition, or indeed basically if your UA machine is still working, how can you extract the value from these guys to allow you to continue back on the UA journey. So that's probably about all we've got time for. I don't know, guys, we've got time for any quick questions. I know we're a few minutes late in starting.
No, we've plenty of time. Don't worry. That was great. That was great, Martin. Now we've got loads of questions in that I'm pulling through, so I'm going to try and ask a couple of them. A lot of insights shared there. I really appreciate that. A lot of sort of practical information and and training your way to think of it. I always learn from things like this because I don't think I think of things in the same way. So I clearly need to. It's very insightful. So I'll try and combine a few of these together and get through 2 or 3 questions.
Sure.
There's a couple of questions here that are around about kind of the size and history of the business, when they become applicable for services like yours and other financing. So there's one about, how long a track record do we need? Is there a minimum, what's the minimum revenues we should be attaining to qualify for services like this? As an indie company, does this work with smaller budgets? Or, so there's all kind of a, the approaching at what point, do they bring you in or come to you?
Yeah, and that's pretty easy. So typically the economics only start to work if you're making above about, say, 25k per month. The most interesting.
Then. I mean, it's not nothing, obviously, but yeah.
Yeah, it's not. You don't need to be multi-millions by any case. And actually, it's the most important thing is really that the UA machine is working, right? And we just helped a company grow. Well, they started with us about 25k a month, and they just got through $2 million a month, right? So
that's good growth.
Yeah,
and you do that for everyone, right? That's your base level promise.
Well, sadly not, because we don't control the UA thing. But the point in that is basically that it can have a fairly low entry point, but as long as the economics are good, then the journey can go all the way up the curve. So typically, and again, we recognize that these are often new companies and stuff, and they've either raised a bit of seed or maybe Series A, whatever, but they just want to be efficient about how they use the capital. So basically, this would be something that is, we'd probably ideally look for a few months of business banking history, but sometimes in the hyper casual space, it's just a different mechanic, right? Yeah. So what we do is with hyper casual, and we work with a bunch of hyper casual studios and publishers. We look at we go through like a very simple diligence process. Is there any money in there to start the scaling process? But recognizing these are very often kind of new games that appear in days or weeks rather than months. So we have an element of flexibility there. For hyper casual guys, as long as there's some budget to start to scale. The great thing about this model for hyper casual, you can take out the money and recycle it within. We do that sometimes on a daily basis for hyper casual developers, so they can be super efficient with the amount of money they need to scale. And what we're seeing more of is people saying, "Hey, I'm going to self-publish my hyper casual game with your capital, as opposed to use a publisher." So that's an interesting direction to travel.
No, fair enough. No, that makes sense. There's a couple more here. Do you see? Let's have a look. There's a couple kind of saying about drop-offs. What happens if you project a certain revenue and then you're kind of think something happens like a random event and drop off. I guess that's the same with any kind of credit. I guess there's discussions that go on then. But a couple more are related to whether there's going to be any kind of changes you're seeing, because you're obviously very plugged into the revenue side of the App Store, because you're loaning money to people about it. So are you seeing any drop-offs or flattening at all related to kind of COVID restrictions is one question. And the other question is, does the IDFA and privacy changes impact the ability to forecast incomes at all?
So that's a really good question. And so we're talking specifically here about users you've already acquired, right? So if you've acquired them and they're on an IAP monetization track, it shouldn't affect it too much. If you're on an ad monetization track, then sure, you may have a bit of a reset there. But to address a little bit of that question, but also the drop off one, the way we think about this and why we think this model is really right sized for gaming is we're repricing this stuff every day. So if your UA is working well and your residual cohorts are performing better, the amount you can borrow just goes up and up and up. If, however, the cohorts are not performing as well, it gets gradually brought down. It doesn't fall off a cliff, but it gets gradually brought down to just, theoretically, the bookend would be just the receivables piece, right? If there's increasingly less residual there, then all you can borrow is basically what's in the platform's bank. So to that end, we think it's a much kind of safer. There's some inherent guardrails to prevent people from continuing to spend on unprofitable UA that gets brought down to ground over time.
I've got two more questions I'll try and get through because we did start a bit late, and I think these are relevant ones. Would you work with a company which had revenue coming from only one or two territories? Would that matter at all?
The territory is not so important. It's more who the payer is. So if all your customers are in the UK and it's Apple that's paying, then that's easy.
The Bank of Apple, we're happy with it.
Well, that's the thing, right? So we look through necessarily the territory. We look through to who's ultimately responsible for paying and how can we verify it. So that's kind of there's ways to structure around most things.
Okay. I've got one more I'm going to get to. It's a bit detailed, so I don't know. If your charts only project without taking into account large organic growth, do you think it's worth a company having multiple projections across their natural growth in order to see the highest, lowest, and average outcome possible?
Absolutely. The more you can, the better. And this is all about trying to, when we spoke about kind of fitting curves, this isn't about picking the golden cohort and then thinking, hey, imagine if every cohort performed like this, would be, billionaires, right? It's not. It's about a measured approach, and it's about having some of the kind of the modeling skills, whatever, some of the tools and things we use in house to basically to build these curves, and to do something that is workable. The last thing you want to do is to be spending a ton of money on UA and then finding out that it's unprofitable, right? So it's about keeping super on top of the numbers the whole time to make this it's a iterative process for sure.
Cool. I have one final question here. Is you say that Pollen's all about financial literacy and supporting people, which you've shared quite a lot of useful insight there. Do you have any specific advice for someone that's just starting out, maybe a smaller developer who maybe new to some of the financial implications of all this? Maybe that goes back to your hyper casual question a little bit. Is there any particular bit of advice or where to go or how to start?
Just just consider all your options. Just be aware of all the options possible, research it, and then only with knowledge can you make the right decisions. So you will need to raise equity capital. How do you do that? You will need, you may want to raise debt capital as well. But don't just think, hey, there's only one way to do this. So there are lots of different ways. There's pros and cons to each. With knowledge comes power, would say. And there's if there's stuff there's burning questions that people have that's not up on CFO Insights, and we've got a really interesting roadmap of just content for that resource, reach out to us and we'll see if we can help.